The Liberating Arts seeks to articulate the enduring relevance of a liberal arts education during a time of pandemic and protest. Through our online platform, we will host a series of conversations with writers, academics, institutional leaders, and public intellectuals about the nature of the liberal arts, their formational purpose, and their moral significance in a time of great cultural disruption. We hope to inspire viewers and listeners to learn more about the liberating effects of these arts on their own lives. To find out more, please visit www.theliberatingarts.org or find us on Twitter, Facebook, Spotify, or YouTube.
Andy, thank you for being here. I'm going to start by introducing people to who you are and we've asked you to join this conversation. I realized that I have 3 of your 4 books, so I'm going to start by doing them
That's
all.
quite good.
We have The Tech-Wise Family, which is your newest book, and I would highly recommend people get this. I love, especially the size of it too, that you can
Yes.
sit down and read this and be like, yes, now I'm ready to implement it. So you give more time to the implementation of this because the reading doesn't take that long. So, and then Strong and Weak, especially for those who are in education. We did this at John Brown University. We went through with our honors staff and also our honors student government board. And we walked through about what this means, which I thought was fantastic. And then Culture Making, which I've had since it came out in 2008. And I reread it again. I find it just as powerful and just as enlightening for our time now, if not more so, I think. So I would highly recommend people grab Culture Making. And hopefully we'll get into some of what culture making has to do with liberal arts, because I find it very informative for what it means to be a maker with these arts that we're talking about. So for those of you who don't know Andy Crouch, he is on the governing board both at Fuller Theological Seminary, but also the Council for Christian Colleges and Universities, which is the primary funder of the Liberating Arts Project. So we are bringing Andy into conversation with us so we can really hear what his thoughts are about the state of liberal arts, especially in Christian higher education. So thank you, Andy.
Thank you for the invitation. I'm thrilled to have this conversation.
Well, so right now, as your role in CCCU, what are you seeing in liberal arts across CCCU or across Christian higher ed, where you have this perspective that I think all of us need to hear from, because you probably have a lay of the land, a greater understanding of what's going on more largely, versus a lot of us are kind of, I don't want to say in the trenches. I don't want to make it a battle zone, but we're at the forefront of these conversations.
Well, I see what I'm sure almost everyone who would want to enter into this conversation sees, which is the liberal arts are under tremendous pressure that has an economic dimension, but I think much more deeply has a cultural dimension. And I think it's very important, at least I would want to put this in a much broader context than Christian higher ed. I think this is a pressure across all of higher ed that actually, I would say, non-Christian institutions are even more vulnerable, and the liberal arts is even more vulnerable in non-Christian settings than Christian settings, with the exception of a tiny group of institutions that basically have achieved escape velocity from economic pressures. And my wife happens to teach at one of them, Swarthmore College, these well-endowed, often coastal liberal arts colleges that sit atop a certain kind of pinnacle of status and so forth. And they'll survive whatever's coming, but everyone else who's trying to offer a liberal arts education is under just terrible stress, and it's true in Christian higher ed as well. Although, we can get into this. I actually, my only remaining hope for the widespread engagement with the liberal arts is Christian higher ed. There will continue to be the Swarthmores and the Amherst and the Williams, and a few students will get to experience that. But for students who, for one reason or another, don't access those institutions, or who want to bring more of themselves and their faith commitment to their education, then those institutions make it easy to do. I just think Christian higher ed is going to be where it's at. So pressure, but also the best opportunity we've got to keep this durable tradition alive, I think.
Yeah. So can I ask 2 follow-up questions about that? So one, why do you think it is that Christian higher ed is not any different than regular higher ed when it comes to the way they view liberal arts? Have they become, just so much in their own culture that they don't understand that they have a different calling than the rest of the world. Or, I mean, why is it the same? In large part, you would want to be able to go to a Christian school and find it so distinctive from anything else you would get, in the so-called secular realm. Why do they look the same right now? That's my first question.
Well, I would want to at least slightly push back on the idea that they look entirely the same. So if a school is going to be Christian, at least in most traditions that I can think of, you've at least got to engage with the Bible. And the moment you engage with the Bible, you're doing something analogous to what the liberal arts kind of require and train us to do. You're crossing cultures. You're stepping out of your own immediate space, at least if it's any kind of serious engagement with scripture, if it's not just like throw a dart at the Bible and see what it says to you today. But if you're at all trying to, and this really to me applies just as much like the most fundamentalist reader as the most kind of assimilated reader, you recognize as you open this book, this is not just addressing me. This is not even addressing me at all at first. I've got to make a connection. And then you've got history in there. You've got philosophy. I'm actually reading Leon Kass's philosophical commentary in the book of Exodus right now called Building God's Nation, where he says, look, we can read this as believers, and to some extent he does as a Jewish believer, but we can also read it just as philosophers asking philosophical questions. And it has all these big philosophical questions in it. Now, reading the Bible alone, or the kind of education you get at, say, a Bible college that really uses the Bible as almost its whole curriculum, is not the same thing as what I think the liberal arts is at its best. But it has some really important analogies, and that's being kept alive in Christian colleges in a way that it's not, there's no an analogy to that in others. Now, at the same time, our colleges, in terms of the classical disciplines of liberal arts, like the things you teach and so many other people teach, those whole departments that are getting cut and programs that are getting cut and majors that are disappearing, that is happening everywhere. And I think it's a testimony to the power of culture, right? Like ultimately, just as the first Christians, the moment they kind of poked their heads even for one moment out of the catacombs, they had to start wrestling with Greek and Roman philosophical categories to try to articulate their doctrine of God. Like they just had to answer the question, what is the essence and existence of God, or however you want to put it? And they were pressured into articulating their faith in a way that made sense in their cultural context, which happened to be highly philosophical, among other things. Well, we now live in a highly technological world. We live in a mammon-driven world like no other set of human beings in all of history. Mammon rules our world in a way that would have been inconceivable even in the 19th century, let alone in the 9th century. Mm-hmm. And the pressures of mammon and its handmade technology, this would be my take on things, impinge on all institutions in extremely powerful ways. And they impinge on the customers of our higher ed institutions, who are students and their families, just trying to make their way in the world and figure out what the next step is for them, often extremely feeling very constrained, very afraid in a way of what the future holds. And there's a set of answers to how to make your way in this technological mammon-driven world that says, well, you might want to major in business, you might want to major in engineering, you might want to acquire a skill that someone will pay you for. And when you frame it that way, it doesn't sound like reading Flannery O'Connor is going to get you there. Yeah. Sorry, I hope that's not cutting too close to home. Yeah. Right? And at the same time, a bunch of other things happened in terms of how these institutions were funded and who wanted and deserved access to these institutions in the eyes of the institutions themselves and the wider society. And all that has reshaped the pressures on the kind of colleges that you've taught at and that I care about and that the CCCU tries to serve. And that is kind of, it doesn't really matter whether you're a Christian or not. You are living in Mammon's empire today, just like the first Christians were living in Caesar's empire, and they had to figure out how to deal with it. So does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the reason I was comparing them and making them the same is it seems like those majors, the engineering major, the major, a lot of these important skills-based training majors, right? Yeah. They're surrendering to, I don't know how to put it. They're, My COVID brain. They can edit that out. But I just had COVID this last week. I'm still in quarantine, so I'm like still trying to like my thoughts aren't working as fast as they normally do. But they have to work with an accrediting body, and that accrediting body determines
Yes.
what is useful or not for their degree. And as those
Yes.
the smaller colleges start making up more and more of the general college, you find that those liberal arts are getting squeezed out to make room for what ultimately matters for that degree. Does that make sense?
Wow. Totally. Yes. I think
Yeah.
that's a very powerful pressure.
Yeah.
And the sort of ever growing list of things that we want students to have been exposed to if we're going to say you're qualified, you have a bachelor's in engineering or whatever. Yeah,
Right.
it's very, very tricky. That makes a lot of sense. And I hadn't quite thought about that other layer of institutional pressure. Although I would also say that ultimately is also the technological society impinging on us with its idea that um, that really what the world is full of is problems that have solutions, and we need people who have the sort of expertise to solve the problems.
Mhm.
And I think that is like the most unliberal arts idea ever,
Yes.
because you don't read literature to solve a problem. So I was very influenced, thankfully, very early in my life by Dorothy Sayers' book, The Mind of the Maker. And she has this one chapter, what she calls Problem Picture, which is about the triumph of the problem solution model in Western culture. And she points out there's just a lot of things in human experience that they can't really properly be described as problems, and they don't properly have solutions. And that's the domain of the artist, narrowly speaking, and it's the domain of the liberal arts, broadly speaking. And just more and more what we want are people who solve problems. Now, the irony is that all this is accelerating at the very moment that our cultural confidence in our collective ability to solve problems is getting lower and lower. So we're discovering just because you have a lot of experts and people with technical ability does not, like, we know a lot about COVID, but we don't actually know how to persuade a reasonable number of people to get a vaccine or to wear a mask or to do any of the other things the experts think ought to be done, because those aren't problems.
Right.
Those are something other than problems.
Yeah,
So
we're treating people and their education like there's boxes to be checked. And the same accrediting bodies that work, not the exact same ones, but the idea of accreditation works across the board at universities. And so you apply the same, as you said, problem solution, you apply the same pressures of accreditation that you have for education or nursing or whatever to the humanities, and you make them, we're going to be equal across the board. Well, it turns out that the humanities can't actually check those same boxes for you, right? They don't have that ability to show, like you said, they don't fit in that paradigm of problem and solution. They don't fit in the paradigm of how to quantify what it is they're doing. And the more pressure they receive to quantify, and then they can't justify their existence based on this quantification system that shouldn't belong to them, and then we cut them. So it seems like if we're going to save them, we have to kind of jump outside of what you're calling, the problem solution paradigm or the accrediting way of looking at it. And instead we have to go back to, especially in Christian higher ed, what are they there for? Why was it that as these Christian institutions, we began not with what the market looked like or what the jobs were, but when we originally founded them, we said, okay, to read the Bible, to know the Lord, to be able to read creation, these are the kinds of things we want students studying to be good Christians, right?
Yeah, I think a complete picture would also acknowledge that some of our institutions, in fact, were founded with extremely pragmatic conceptions of what education was, and often very well intentioned such. So, and there is this pragmatic stream specifically in American evangelicalism that's always been susceptible to the idea that actually you don't need that book learning to be a good Christian, even to read the Bible, like seminary, cemetery, all that stuff. Like that's very deep in the American Protestant tradition, especially its more evangelical expressions. So sometimes the liberal arts were added as a kind of a status move. And then once they no longer confer status and economic opportunity, they ebb away. So it's a complicated inheritance and it's somewhat institution dependent. I think the accreditation thing is interesting because when you think about why does that have so much power? Ultimately, really, it's because of access to federal funds, because federal funds are contingent in this kind of paragovernmental way on these non-governmental but still government-like accrediting bodies. And it didn't used to be the case. Families used to make their own judgments about where they would spend their money on their child's further education. And when you really go back to the founding of the Republic, it was, who would you apprentice yourself to? Which lawyer would you study with? Which clergy member would you get further education with essentially as an apprentice? And you trusted that person's reputation. We probably need some kind of mediating institutions in a society as complex as ours, and especially for families that don't have maybe that haven't had the chance to develop the social capital to know who to trust. But channeling it all through government funding has turned out to be has put our institutions, our Christian institutions, made them beholden to the technological logic that drives our government, drives the funding of education in this country, drives policy on what matters in education in state universities, and the big state institutions all are totally captive to a different kind of ideology now. Mm-hmm. And we're kind of brought along for the ride in that.
Right. Okay. So now I had the first follow-up that we never actually got to.
Oh, yes. Sorry.
Now I have a second one that I wonder if, I hope it's not a rabbit trail, because I am personally very interested in how you would answer it. But the first one was, you said you saw a lot of hope in the Christian institutions. So their pressures aren't exactly the same, but they are succumbing in some ways to mammon and to that. But at the same time, you feel like there's a lot of hope in Christian higher ed to keep and hold on to the liberal arts. So why would you find that hope there? What is it that Christian higher ed can do or should be doing? Where is that hope found in those institutions?
I think the deepest layer of it, I think there's a couple layers. One is just the most fundamental is we believe the world holds together. Christ is the one in whom and through whom and for whom all things are created. In him, all things hold together. And therefore, there's nothing to be known in the universe that doesn't have, cosmic and Christian significance, right? And our neighbors no longer believe that. My wife's fellow faculty at Swarthmore, who are by and large excellent teachers and excellent scholars and great colleagues, if they believe that, they can't justify it. They don't know how to articulate why they believe that's true, if they still believe it, and many of them don't. And certainly the technicians who kind of are setting the agenda for higher ed don't believe it or give it no thought. But Christians have to believe it, have to give it thought. And so I feel like the only place in America that still believes there's a universe, a cosmos that has a unity of truth, goodness, beauty to it, are places of biblical faith, Jewish and Christian. And there's one, Zaytuna, that's a Muslim institution as well. And so that would be the deepest thing. I think the slightly more secondary thing, as we've alluded to, is if you really want to read the Bible at all seriously, the liberal arts come along for the ride, because you are going to need history to put the scriptures in context. You are going to need linguistics, language, all the levels of the analysis of language and literature. You're going to need philosophy, because the Bible raises ultimate questions that can only be sort of rigorously attended to using tools of philosophy. You don't necessarily need to use all the categories or methods of Western philosophy, but clearly it's philosophy. So and the Bible is full of art, and so the arts and the imaginative arts, the creative arts, the performing arts are there in Scripture. And therefore, surely if we're going to play all the instruments listed in Psalm 150 or whatever instruments correspond to our own cultural context, somebody ought to get good at those, right? And then they shouldn't just get technically good at those, but they should actually know why it is meaningful to be good at a musical instrument. Well, that's musicology, right? So I just feel like if you take the Bible seriously at all, even if the Western liberal arts tradition somehow disappeared, and I hope this will happen over time, say in the African context where Christianity is replanting itself, or in the, say, South Asian context where Christianity has done the same, or in China, I think ultimately you'd reinvent all these things to do justice to what it means to be biblical people.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're just kind of preaching Augustine's ideas, right? The Doctrina, like you have to read all the different. And I'm completely on board with you. I even tell students, I would add that studying things they find to be useless is getting closer to studying God, because God is useless. so,
Yes.
so
Yes.
they can practice attending to useless things.
I've given some talks where I talk about art as the artistic dimension of any given thing. And I think all good human work has an artful aspect to it, though not all human work is art per se, but it all should be artful if it's to be good work. And it is precisely that aspect of human activity that cannot be reduced to utility. The exact, I would argue, I'm Kant is in the background here and others, that the defining characteristic of art is unusefulness, which is not quite the same thing as useless. In fact, it's essential for human life to have this. But then where people get really nervous, as I say, and this is exactly what prayer is, right? Is prayer utilitarian? Does prayer accomplish something in the world? Well, not in the usual sense of that word, or else God would just be a kind of a machine that we, activate by our prayers. And instead, prayer is this encounter that we do believe has effects in the world, but we can't describe. You don't pray because it's useful. You certainly don't worship God because it's useful. So the liberal arts meet the practice of faith on the ground of no utility.
Right.
But of course,
and on making.
Completely. But I feel like I'm not doing justice to the thing, and to a very important part of the thing. I don't say the other thing that's unuseful in the world is people. People are not means to an end. People are an end. It doesn't matter if you're useful to me. I still am meant to love, reverence, contemplate, respect you and the fact that you are in the world. And if I don't have practice doing that through my prayer and my worship, and through the way I've disposed myself in my study and my intellectual formation, what are the chances that when I encounter someone who doesn't seem very useful to me, that I'm going to treat them with reverence, and that I'm going to discover the gift that they are to me? Yeah. So there's a lot that hangs on whether we have a capacity for the unuseful, a developed capacity for the unuseful in the formation of our lives.
Well, and so let me ask a question that might be treading into some hot water here about that, because you were saying that people used to find somebody they would study under, and it was that relationship that led them to do what it is they're doing. And I'm wondering how much more, if we invested in faculty in a certain way that made them these kind of master teachers you want to apprentice yourself to, and those relationships became central, how much our institutions would change. Because instead, what they currently are is that faculty are just another box that needs to be checked, and we up the faculty efficiency ratio to cover as much students as we can, or we move online, which I think is, what are we doing there? I'm now an online teacher. That's mostly where I teach. I teach grad students online. So what does that do to the liberal arts when we have transferred that practice of being useless to one another, or not basing our relationships on usefulness, into a new paradigm in which all of our encounters are transactional, even in higher ed?
Oh man, it's just so damaging. It's so damaging. I mean, I get how hard it is to come up with an economic model that works for this. I mean, that is a reality, and I don't begrudge any academic administrator who is trying to figure out how to just balance the books in a tuition dependent, which really in many ways means U.S. government grant dependent kind of economic environment, and in our economy. This is hard, but I think we shouldn't fool ourselves and thinking that we're doing anything of very great importance if all we do is increase a certain kind of efficiency of output at the cost of personal formation. And Jesus also lived in a highly pressured world. It didn't have the same economic structures as our world by any means, but certainly Caesar never thought the way to get things done is to walk around Galilee for 3 years with a handful of men and women and tell them stories and do a few miracles. I mean, there were ways that Rome got things done at scale, right? And Rome was very good at getting things done at scale. And they had benefited from financial and industrial and knowledge revolutions very similar in form, if not in content, to what has built our modern world. And and not just Jesus, but the way of the first Christians just was not to reinscribe a Roman kind of formation on people. And something happened in those first couple centuries that was radically different and outlasted the empire. And if we're serious about Christian higher education within the economic world as we have it, we've got to like thread that needle and find that path. And even with your Zoom teaching, I will say one thing that I've been very surprised about this past year, which in many ways has been so difficult. When it's a small group, I actually have found I've had some incredibly formative and transformative encounters with other persons through the medium that we're using right now. I'm more open to it than I was a year and a half ago, to be totally honest. When it's a large group, I don't think it has the same effect. But relationship is possible through some of these technologies, and deep conversation is possible. But not if what you're going for is efficiency.
Yeah. And it does change the dynamic, because going from in-person settings in which I'd have students over and the mess of my children getting in the way while I'm hosting dinner with these students, and the humiliation usually that I experience as trying to both be the professor they've seen in the classroom, but be the mom and the wife and the teacher, and I'm a homemaker, and just all of that chaos, I think, is also really good. It is good in a way that you can censor and cut with Zoom, right? And protect that sphere, protect the lighting, protect it. There's still...
No, totally. Well, but so I think this gets to even a deeper question, which is, what do we really think education is?
Yeah.
And to what extent are we invested in a kind of professionalization of something that never was really meant to be that way? Now, I certainly am not trying to imply that we should lower our standards somehow for example, I don't know, for who's qualified to teach. Like, it's meaningful that you have read the books you've read, that you've written the works you've written, because that implies a kind of depth of engagement with a particular domain that gives you authority, right? And I'm not at all questioning that, but there's this other layer of professionalization that would divorce or separate that work that you've done in what we call your professional domain from your calling as a mother, wife, and homemaker. When Mary sat at Jesus' feet, and Martha's there as well, well, that somebody has to prepare dinner, and Jesus is surely not saying, don't ever prepare dinner. He's just saying, here's a moment of teaching, but it's not in school. They're not in school. They're in a home.
Yeah.
I recognize we can't remake our institutions overnight to completely expunge the kind of the 200-year-old kind of trajectory of professionalization. But I think we might well consider ourselves to be living in conscious resistance to it with all of our big choices, and be better off if we did.
Yeah, well, I want to actually push a lot of bounds. I'm not saying that we implode the system, but
it's imploding just fine without our help.
Right. I mean, that's the problem. I think this has been the deal for me, being within the academy. I've been teaching since 2004. I don't even know how long that is. So I've been teaching for a while within the academy, and have been at various universities. So I'm not just talking about one, but the whole system of grades, right, in a liberal arts context, makes almost no sense, especially when you get into the humanities idea. You look at someone like Simone Weil, who said, if you are leading students to focus on their grades, you're leading them away from the habits of attention that would lead them to a prayerful life. And so here we are trying to teach them to be contemplative, but they're trying to perform the acts of contemplation so that I can breathe, right? It doesn't make any sense with what we're actually doing. And I think one of the reasons that it has fallen apart is because we really have tried to impose upon, like you said, these studies in a way that doesn't fit them. Now, I don't know what that means. Does that mean that we return more to the K through 12 model? Do we do more localized K through 16 liberal arts study, or K through 14 liberal arts study? And then we move into our professions. What are the right models that
Yeah.
could move us forward, where we really can get, like you said, the deep study of the things that matter and the things that form us
Right. Right.
before the specialization, or maybe in conjunction with, that doesn't fit what we're currently doing. I mean, I guess what
That's
I'm
so
asking you is, or
interesting.
what are the innovative ways
Wow.
that we can buck the system or resist it and become something better, maybe?
You know, this activates a sort of inchoate idea I've been nursing for a while, which is I do wonder if we're not vastly underestimating the intellectual capacity of, say, 12 to 18-year-olds. So I and I wonder if it might. I'm very intrigued by the idea that maybe the place and time for liberal arts is not after whatever it is, 14 years of public school,
Yeah.
where you've been largely bored, but you did well in school. So someone says, well, you should go to college, and you were good at writing, so maybe you should major in English. But maybe the moment, even when it might be more economically viable in certain respects, if only because students of this age are still living at home rather than having to create this whole residential apparatus that often we feel it goes along with college. What if we asked more of, I think I get the idea that young children, the grammar, logic, rhetoric kind of idea, like they start out not ready for the ultimate questions that the liberal arts really care most about, I think. But aren't they ready by 12 or 13? I mean, I had an English teacher in ninth grade who changed my life, Mrs. Nardiello. I went in a total technician. I loved programming computers. I was good at computers. This was in the very, very early days of computers. This was when Syracuse University, where my dad taught, had 2 computers. And so I would go to the university to work on the computer. If you had asked me going into ninth grade, what are you going to do with your life? I'd be like, oh, I'm going to be a computer programmer. Like, that's the coolest thing you could possibly do.
Yeah.
And 2 things happened. One is we moved to a new school district that had higher expectations. I realized there were other kids who were way better at kind of the underlying math and algorithmic thinking than I was, actually. But then I took ninth grade English with Mrs. Nardiello. And, did I approach some of those texts? I mean, we read classic texts, Shakespeare and a lot of poetry and so forth. Did I approach that with full, emotional maturity? Certainly not. Intellectual maturity? Not entirely. Not in the way I read Euripides when I was 20, say, in my classics degree. But was I seriously able to engage with the questions raised by King Lear or Romeo and Juliet or whatever? Yes, I was. And a lot of kids are. And a lot more than we think are.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting thought experiment. What if we didn't sort of conceded that maybe when you're 18, it's time to think about the shape of your calling and specialize. But what if we expected way more of when you're like 8 to 18?
Yeah.
I mean, I taught my kids Greek and Latin respectively, my son and my daughter, and had them reading those, early stage, simple texts, the kind you could read after a year or 2 of Greek and Latin. And starting when they were 7 and 8 years old, and they were totally capable of doing it. Now I had capable kids. Not every kid would be interested in that. Not every kid would have the patience, but a lot would. And yet we ask almost none to even try.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I'm just trying to think outside the box more. You just said that you did Greek and Latin at home. Like, I'm doing Latin at home. I'm doing Greek by myself right now, just during
awesome.
the summer
Yeah.
for fun, because I've never studied Greek. But how much better is it to study things in that kind of situation? Like, what if it was Sunday school in churches and we started encouraging churches to study Latin and Greek and Hebrew? And that's what your Sunday school was. Or even if you were in the colleges, what if instead of pouring this money into what we call student life activities, right, they were great books?
Yeah.
And so you're studying to be an engineer, but your student life, the contemplating, the free was like your poetry.
Wow. Yes.
So you don't have the grades in those. You just sit and enjoy poetry with your, I just feel like we're limiting ourselves by an old model that is not really allowing for the freedom of those things to be enjoyed the way they need to be enjoyed.
Wow. Which gets back to the utilitarian, and I think it's why grades are dangerous. I'll say I have a sort of ambivalent feeling about that, because what I don't want to lose is kind of an expectation of excellence that
Mhm.
is actually rigorously assessed.
Yes.
And I think it's really important. I mean, actually, speaking of Mrs. Nardiello, my ninth grade English teacher, she did something no teacher, I mean, this will perhaps sound weird or odd for me to say, but no teacher before or since had ever done. She gave me a C- on a paper. It's the lowest grade I've ever gotten on a paper.
Mhm.
I didn't think it was such a bad paper, and I was too close to it at the time to really, I don't know, maybe it really was that bad. What I know it was less of a paper than I was capable of writing, and I kind of phoned it in, and she saw that. And however it may have compared to other papers other kids turned in, she realized what I needed at the right grade for that effort was C-.
Yeah.
And boy, did that wake me up. Look, honestly,
Yeah.
I remember seeing the grade in red in a circle on the last page
Yeah.
and thinking, I failed to do what this teacher expects I can do. Anyway, so great. I
I
have
think about this
mixed
all the
feelings.
time. I think about this all the time because we run a school, right? So I've had to consider assessment quite a bit. And for the
Yeah,
last
yeah,
4 years, maybe, that I was teaching at John Brown University, I didn't give grades.
yeah.
And what I did, but I did qualitative assessment. So your
Yeah,
paper was written all over. And the
yeah,
less it got written over
yeah,
as you turned in subsequent drafts, by the end, where you saw very minimal remarks, you knew you had gotten somewhere
yeah. I love it.
by the
Wow,
end of it, which is
that's
actually
great.
more like real life if you think
Real,
about it.
that's how it works for me as a real working writer. I mean, my
Yes,
editor turns back my book with
exactly.
a lot of comments and then fewer comments,
Fewer,
hopefully.
fewer, and fewer. And that's the way
Yeah,
that life looks. And so for me, it's
yeah,
not about rigorous standards of excellence. For you
right,
at that moment,
right.
you needed a C- because you were imagining a paradigm in which your excellence was being ranked by an ABC system.
Yeah, yeah,
But if
yeah,
instead you got used to a system of a lot of red
yeah,
marks, you
yeah,
can
yeah.
actually respond to or
Yes.
not, like you would get
No,
used.
I see. That's so good.
Yeah.
That's so
So
good.
I guess I don't mean to just like throw all my ideas out there, but these are things
No, I love it. I
I'm thinking
love
about
it.
all the time. It's like, what do we do? And I think the way we're continually going cannot be the way we keep going, or we're going to have like the fall of Rome, and then we're going to have dark ages that we have to
Yeah,
rebuild and move. I mean, Lewis
yeah.
would hate that I just used dark ages, but we would have a time of rebuilding that would have to take place. So I guess the big question on the table is how do we not have an implosion and a rebuild? What
Yeah.
does it look like now for maybe the CCCU to work within this process
Hmm,
to
hmm,
to do
hmm,
well by the liberal arts? How can
hmm,
we invest in that? How can we change imaginations about
hmm,
what the liberal arts mean going forward,
hmm,
so that we
hmm,
can actually hold on to them the way they need to be held
hmm.
on to?
I love how, yeah, honestly, you're pressing me to think more imaginatively than I was maybe coming into this conversation thinking. And I think by the same token, I think there will be so much pressure on those of us who love the liberal arts to try to save what has been,
Mhm.
um, which may be a very unwise use of our energy compared to forging some very new ways for these perennial practices, disciplines, and subjects, let's say, to find their place. Maybe in partly because, here's something that has been haunting me for quite a while. Because my wife does teach at one of these highly endowed, I mean, Swarthmore actually has the highest endowment per student of any institution, even more than Harvard University.
Oh, wow.
So just these are places of incredible wealth. Now, to their credit, they're trying to extend that wealth to people who didn't grow up themselves with incredible wealth, but still there's just privilege hovering around all this stuff. And one of my fears has been, well, what's going to happen is the number of institutions that can hold on to the liberal arts the way they've been done is just going to shrink to a small privileged number.
Mhm.
And a certain kind of student who has certain kinds of aptitudes and presents themselves at a given stage of life, namely high school, with certain abilities, gets selected for those places. And I understand why that happens. I don't think it's all bad that that happens in that way per se. But man, that's a loss if it becomes this rarefied thing for people, either of a certain amount of just privilege or a certain amount of innate ability that really they didn't ask for and isn't their fault or their credit. So I think the idea that that organizations like the CCCU could foster tremendous on the edge innovation and creativity rather than shore up how we think it ought to be done is really, I think, at the heart of the matter.
And that way we don't offer something fake. I mean, that's what I'm worried about. Is not only will it just become this elite group that only gets the liberal arts the way they need to be, like the Swarthmore.
Yeah.
Even worse, we'll pretend we're offering liberal arts and we'll offer a fake version that nobody sees any value in for such a long time that people will forget what they actually were or why they matter.
Wow. Yeah.
So,
One other, I mean, just one thing to underscore is I think this is the great challenge for all of our institutions, basically. It comes down to persons. There is a personal encounter, at least in my life, that is the only way that these disciplines are activated. And I've sometimes I've thought about this in terms of online or mediated education. I think there's two things I learned in my 40s as my kind of midlife crisis activities. I learned, going back to my computer programming youth, I learned the computer programming language Ruby, which is just an object-oriented programming language. And then I took up the cello, and I studied the cello with a neighbor who's a very fine cellist and teacher of the cello. And Ruby, I learned entirely online. I have never sat with another human being and had them teach me anything about Ruby. And I am a medium competent Ruby programmer. I don't know if I could get a job, but I could get an interview, let's say, as a Ruby programmer. I know what I'm doing, and I can build stuff in it. The cello was entirely personal. My teacher would literally come and put his hand on my hand and move my hand until it was in the right configuration on the fretboard or whatever, fingerboard. And there's a spectrum of things that we can learn to be efficacious in the world. And some of them you can learn totally online. And some of them, and I would argue any serious musical attainment has to be personal. There's just no way around that personal one-on-one encounter with a teacher. Everything in our world is pressing people towards the Ruby side of the equation, and there's a place for that. And I find great joy in programming still avocationally. But what we're going to have to figure out how to invest in is the things that happen in the encounter of persons. And I don't think there's anything in the liberal arts that doesn't depend on the encounter of persons. So how do we find ways to make that economic, make it real, as you said, because I think the fake versions of these are not very real, not very personal. How do we do that? That would be the thing to work on, Jessica.
Yeah.
So go work on that thing.
Yes, thank you. And I think that is a beautiful illustration for us to end on. And also really that puts the question out there. And like any good liberal arts inquiry, it begins with questions and continues with greater questions. And I think that that's the way it's supposed to be. That keeps us humble as we move forward. So I really appreciate you ending with a question. So that was great. Well, thank you for spending this time.
Thank you so much. What a pleasure.